avoid some other possibilities for white here. For example, after take, and knight f6. Here f3 is an option with the idea of trying to put black in the bind. And of course, the true dragon can't be put in the Maroczy bind. The accelerated dragon can, but not the regular dragon. So I like to avoid that position. And here, after knight f6, if white plays this move, pawn takes c5, we don't recapture, which would lead to a good position for white. We play this move, queen a5 check, forking this pawn. And if white responds with knight c3, we can play knight takes c4, the comfortable position here for black. But very rare for white to take on c5. So after knight f6, Adamson replied knight c3, takes on d4, knight takes d4, g6. So we enter the mainline dragon. And this was a good battle between pretty evenly matched players. Both Robbie and I are IM elects. We both have all of our IM norms, but are awaiting a 2,400 FIDE rating before we can get our title. And Robbie actually beat me the following year in a USCL match, so he got his revenge from this game. So in this one is g6, bishop e3, going into the Yugoslav attack, the most dangerous attacking setup against the dragon. And the only one I think black really needs to be concerned about. Bishop g7 and f3, keeping that black knight off of g4, knight c6, and queen d2, and castle. So we reach that main dragon position where white has the option to play bishop c4, which is what we talked about in the last video, where we saw that Karpov-Korchnoi game. And the other main move here for white is to castle queenside. And that's what happened in this game. So white castle queenside, and here black has two main options. He can play d5, which breaks open the center, and usually leads to a comfortable position. Or it's possible to play what I played in this game, knight takes d4, and after bishop takes d4, to play bishop e6, and here black's plan is to play queen a5, rook c8, rook b8, b5, and b4 with a monstrous attack. And Robbie played the best and the trickiest move here, king b1. And the idea behind king b1 is that prevents black's main move, queen a5. So maybe you can tell me what's wrong with queen a5. You can pause the tape and think about it. Okay, the problem with queen a5 is that here white has a very good move, knight d5, which gives black big problems. Now the queens are facing, and white is ready to take this pawn on e7 with check. So after black takes white's queen, white makes this intermediate move, knight takes e7 check, forcing king h8, and now rook takes d2, and white has an extra pawn in the ending. Still, white needs to make a couple of precise moves after rook e8, knight d5. It looks like after bishop takes d5, like black caught white because it's not possible to recapture because of this mate on e1. But after bishop takes d5, white doesn't need to panic. He can take on f6 intermediately, and white's going to go up by a pawn. For example, after bishop takes a2 check, king takes a2, bishop takes f6, rook takes d6, and white has a bishops of opposite color ending with rooks on the board with the extra pawn, which of course is much better for white. So after king b1, queen a5 doesn't work, so the main move for black here is queen c7, with the idea of playing rook fc8, and then playing queen a5. And Robbie played knight d5 here, which isn't the main move. Usually white continues with h4, just starting his attack. And here black's idea is to go rook fc8, and after h5, now he's ready for queen a5, because after knight to d5, queen takes d2, there's no time for knight takes e7, because after king f8, this knight is under attack. And black will have an extra piece in this ending. But Robbie played this move knight d5, which isn't a bad move, it's been played before. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and still rook fc8. Time for black to get this pressure along the c file. And now, for example, if white starts his attack with h4, I can simply take this pawn on d5, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and queen takes d5 isn't possible because black has this mate, this back rank mate on c1. So Robbie played this preventative move, rook c1, protecting the c2 pawn. And I played knight d7. Normally black doesn't want to trade off his dragon bishop, but here white isn't trying too hard to attack black's king side, so my idea was to play positionally, to trade these bishops to get rid of white's two bishops advantage, and then try to play with a strong knight against a bad bishop, which is ultimately what happened. So bishop takes g7, king takes g7, h4, and now I had time for this h5 move, stopping white's attack, and that h5 pawn can be reinforced with moves like rook h8 and knight f6. White played g4, and here I would never want to take on g4, because after h5, here white's attack is becoming very strong. But my idea, like I said, was to reinforce that pawn on h5, so I played knight f6, and now white has to make a decision. If he plays g5, attacking the knight, now these pawns are locked up, and white has no future of an attack on the king side. So Robbie took, and I took back with the knight, and it's a good square for the knight, h5. The rook can come to h8 and support it, and in the future that knight can sometimes come into f4 or back to f6. And of course, white's pawns are not so great here. Bishop h3, attacking the rook, and I wanted to play rook h8 anyway. And bishop g4 with some ideas to trade. And I play queen c4, this is a good active move. Now black's queen becomes active, and if white takes this knight after rook takes h5, black is clearly better in light of white's weaknesses. This pawn on d5 is a weakness, and these pawns are very weak. So white continued rook e1, putting pressure on this weak e7 pawn. And here, it looks like white's pressure is becoming strong, and black has to come up with something. And I found this move, queen f4, which I believe is a strong move. I wasn't worried about going into the endgame, even though I would be down a pawn. Because if queen takes f4, knight takes f4, and rook takes e7, here I'm not going to recapture this d5 pawn, because then after rook takes b7, white is doing pretty well. But my idea was to play rook e8 and try to play with active pieces. And now, if rook takes b7, black has the tactical shot, rook takes h4, activating black's pieces and giving him a good position. And if rook takes e8, here I had to assess this position, And I believe that even though black is a pawn down, the activity of black's pieces, the strong rook on the e file, this excellent knight here on f4, and a slightly more active king, I believe gives black at least enough compensation for the pawn that he's down. I like black in this position. So in the game, Robbie decided not to go for that ending, instead played queen c3 check. I played queen f6, and now, of course, if queen takes f6, I can simply take with my king and defend the pawn. My king is very active. Queen c7, putting pressure on more weak pawns. And I play knight f4 now and activate my knight, and Robbie takes the pawn on e7. And here, I could maybe play like I talked about earlier, take, and rook e8, but I think I found an even stronger move. I play rook e8 now. So if queen takes e8, it's possible to play this position with two rooks and the bishop against queen and knight, but the queen and knight coordinate so well together that I felt my position here was comfortable. So white played this move, queen c7. Queen takes b7 isn't possible because rook b8, x-raying was checkmate on b2. So queen c7, and here this position is very sharp, and a lot of things seem to be hanging by a thread, and I found what I believe is a nice tactical resource for black. So why don't you pause the video here and see if you can find it. I played this move, queen takes h4, which turns the position into a real mess. So back rank tactics are hanging everywhere. Of course, rook takes e8, not possible. Queen takes h1, and it's also not possible to take the queen on h4 because rook takes e1, checkmate. So after queen takes h4, it looks at a first glance like white might be lost because now it's threats on both e1 and h1, threatening to take either of these rooks. But white has this move, queen c3 check, which saves his position. I go queen f6 and block, and rook takes h8. Now here, this is decision time. There are a lot of different routes that black can go. I can play queen takes c3, in which case white is forced to take this rook on e8. It's not possible to take on c3 because I take e1 with check and then take on h8. So here, if I take on c3, white would be forced to take on e8, and I can have a position with queen and knight against two rooks and a bishop. Another option, I can play rook takes e1 check. And then after queen takes e1, I take on h8, and I have a position with queen and knight against queen and bishop. And the third option, I can play rook takes h8, and now after queen takes f6, king takes f6, I have a position with rook and knight against rook and bishop. So, which way to go? Certainly, it's not an easy decision, and it wasn't for me. So, you can pause the video here, take some time, and think about which one of these imbalances you would like to play with. Actually, I thought black was doing fine in all three of those positions, but I remembered a lesson I learned early on from my coach, Tom O'Connor, who told me that usually a bishop is going to be a little bit stronger than a knight, and that a rook and bishop is usually a little bit stronger than a rook and knight. However, a queen and knight usually dominate a queen and bishop because the queen and bishop can only create threats on one color square, but the queen and knight can attack different colors of squares and create a lot of mating threats. So I played rook takes e1, forcing a position where I had a queen and knight against queen and bishop, and a very strong knight at that. So rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and king takes h8, and here black stands clearly better in this ending due to his activity and the strength of his knight. Bishop c8, b6, protecting the pawn, and queen e4, a good centralizing move for the queen. I played king g7. Everything else I felt was good. My queen is strong on f6, my knight's good on f4, so I wanted to improve my king. a3, preventing any back rank checkmates. And knight g2, preparing ideas like queen f4, where I can trade queens. And even though the queen and knight coordinate well together here, white's king is very safe. I can't really get any threats against the king. And I felt like the ending with knight against bishop would be good for me because I felt my knight was strong, and I have the potential here with the 2-on-1 majority on the king side to create an outside pass pawn, which would give me a good position. So white played c4, protecting this pawn and preparing later for maybe some idea to play b4, c5, and some kind of breakthrough I have to be careful about. I played queen f4 to trade the queens, and white doesn't have many alternatives here. He trades the queens and activates the king, but my king gets into the center first with king e5, and here the knight is just so maneuverable. I have time to put it literally anywhere that I want on the board. b4, preparing sometimes a c5 advance, but c5 is never a threat as long as the d5 pawn is a weakness. f5, I advance my kingside pawns, bishop d7, and g5. Bishop c8 waiting, and now I maneuver my knight. And so my threat is to play either knight h4 or knight e1 and just win this pawn. White's forced to bring his king over to protect the pawn. And f4. Bishop a6, and now king d4, the king penetrates, and now white simply can't hold all these weaknesses. So it was desperation times c5. Otherwise, I can just play knight f5, knight e3, and take this pawn. And white's not equipped to defend everything here. So probably try this move c5. I play b takes c5. I wouldn't want to take this way and allow this d pawn to run. And now not recapturing on c5, but rather b5 with the idea to play a4, a5, b6, and make a pass pawn. I play c4 so that my king can get back and I start to run this pass pawn. a4, and king takes d5. Bishop c8, and king c5, preventing a5. And Robbie prepares a5 with bishop d7, and now king b4, preventing a5. Bishop c6, one last trick, king takes a4 doesn't work because b6 check gives white a winning position. But of course I saw that. Knight f5, king d2, and knight e3, a5, I take, king c3, king b6, and white resigned as black has 3 extra pawns, and white has no answer for that. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I felt it was a good representation of how black can play that line of the dragon when white castles on move 9 and then plays the knight d5 setup. And I felt like the way I continued gave black a comfortable game. So next time we can see some of the other sharp lines involving where white castles queenside on move 9. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Bruh. I mean, it's alright. Bruh. Huh? Nope. Huh?